Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
As we move towards the end of the year and have cleared the first Brexit hurdle, can we look ahead to our future outside the EU beyond 2021? What will it mean for the image that we project to the world? Is this a chance to reinvent ourselves? We did with the Industrial Revolution, with empire, good or bad, and after the Second World War. So what next? I'm now joined by the writer, Sarfraz Manzoor. Rebecca Walton is the Regional Director for Europe at the British Council. And from Stanford University, the historian Neil Ferguson. Good evening, all of you. And I'd like to bring in, first of all, with you, Neil. What is your version and your vision, I should say, for the future of Britain after 2021, say the next 5 years?
Well, I would love to believe what the Brexiteers promised, that by voting to leave the European Union, we'd become global Britain and perhaps part of a vital new rejuvenated Anglosphere. But I have to say my impression at this point is that rather the opposite is happening, that the divorce process, which, by the way, may well still be going on 5 years from now, is so absorbing British political culture that we've become significantly more parochial since the referendum, more inward-looking. And I visit Britain regularly from the United States. I'm struck every time I come by just how far Brexit is consuming us and causing us to turn inwards rather than outwards. In that sense, the Brexiteers' plan is going rather wrong. But
if you say that actually it is the political class that doesn't have the wherewithal to rise above this and lead us to a new beginning, then maybe it's other people, maybe it's cultural figures, maybe it's industrialists, maybe it's scientists, maybe people have actually got to say, this is, we all voted for this in a referendum. We can't leave it to politicians to define our new place in the world.
Well, part of the problem, Kirsty, is that I think there was an assumption back in 2016 that something was happening simultaneously in the United States that would create a new Atlantic relationship. Mm-hmm. That something, of course, was the populist wave that produced Donald Trump. And there was a brief moment when Trump talks about Brexit and people were excited about Trump. But we now are in late 2017, and it's clear that British people are about as negative on Donald Trump as people on the European continent. In fact, it's one of those signs of just how European we are, that we hate Donald Trump almost as much as the Germans, the Dutch and the Swedes do. So the problem with the Brexit vision of global Britain is that if global Britain doesn't include the United States, if it doesn't include a broader Anglosphere, then what exactly is it?
Well, I'm
sceptical that there's any there, frankly.
I'll ask the British Council view on that, Rebecca, because, I mean, the British Council, in a sense, is charged with forging new international relations, creating new bonds. Maybe it won't be towards America, but do you see, in a way, this an opportunity to reinvent and build new ties?
I think refind as well as reinvent, Kirsty, because I think we've been a global nation. The idea of global Britain suddenly emerging and after the referendum seems to me slightly bizarre. I mean, we were 400, 500 years a global nation, if nothing else. So I always worry about that reinvention, but I think refinding that connection with a whole lot of other parts of the world, yes, very important. As if we're going to make this reinvention, as you call it, then that's where we'll have to turn.
But we also have to maybe reinvent the relationship with the rest of the European Union.
Oh, indeed, we do have to do that. But there's a lot of tolerance for that, I think. I mean, one thing, picking up on what Neil said, this consuming conversation around the divorce is not consuming most Europeans. It's consuming the technocrats of Brussels and the representative of the structures. But the people of Europe have moved on already. They all have their own problems, their own identity issues, migration issues, industrial issues, and developing their own economies. They're all doing that, and they see us as a friend and somebody that they know. So the divorce isn't such a huge gap.
But then, Sarfraz Manzoor, we're in a situation now where The country in many ways is divided. It's divided nations, it's divided locally, it's divided city by city, it's divided urban and rural. What is the mechanism by which we come together and become very kind of proactive in forging and making the country look different, physically different perhaps?
I think you've got 90 seconds for this, haven't you?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems to me that there's a bit of a disconnect between the first part of the programme, which was all about the sort of the technicalities of the discussions, etc., and the reason why people voted for Brexit. For me, Brexit was an emotional vote. It was a protest vote that's now being turned into a viable policy. And so the question about the division, for me, it's about, well, you've got people who are feeling like they essentially would yearn for a simpler past, or a vision of England or Britain, which frankly has fewer immigrants in it.
Monocultural.
A monocultural one where they feel more comfortable, perhaps because they feel that they haven't economically benefited, perhaps because they feel the politicians don't speak for them. And then you've got the people who are Remainers who essentially feel more comfortable with that. So for me, the idea of the vision of Britain is, how do you do something which doesn't just return to old ideas about Britain alone, which don't actually include the empire in the same way, don't include the newer arrivals. So it's about trying to create a new version of Britain.
And who does that?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of things won't really change, it seems to me. I mean, like, you know, you're talking about with, you know, people are still going to want to go to universities across Britain, across Europe. People from Europe are going to want to come to here. The arts things are going to carry on. But I suppose, in a way, for me, it's about a symbolic thing about, do we want England or Britain to feel small, or do we want to feel like we're connected? Personally, the wider the label, the more comfortable I feel.
So how do we make that connectedness, Neil Ferguson? I mean, where do, for example, our economic strength lie? Does it lie in, you know, high-end engineering? Does it lie in medical science? Does it lie in the creative industries? How do we make a new mark in the world?
Well, the United Kingdom sold itself, you may remember, Kirsty, as Cool Britannia back in the 1990s. And I think part of the charm of Brexit for the rest of the world is that we're going to market ourselves as Square Britannia. People don't realise how appealing Jacob Rees-Mogg is as a character around the world, because from the vantage point of Americans and indeed Asians and Africans, he's a wonderfully stereotypical figure.
But you know, charming as that is, we have to say that, you know, the whole point about this is to free us up to have international trade, to make new partnerships, to make new relationships. How do we do that?
I mean, the rest of the world is very complex, and I don't think having a square image is going to keep you in the mainstream of the fast-moving, complex, developing world. I think we have to recognise that we need to join it with a tone that recognises both our strengths, but also without boasting. And I think that we tip very quickly in Britain from a position of great strength in many areas, but we tend then to use it in some way that isn't quite as alluring as you'd want to bring people to you.
Yes.
And I mean, just speaking up just about the charming Jacob Rees-Mogg, I mean, I think one of the problems is I don't think there are people, particularly in politics, who are speaking in an optimistic vision of what it means to be part of Britain.
So who does it if they're not doing it? That's my point. Why do we leave that to the politicians?
Well, maybe those are things that happen organically through culture, whether it's through festivals, whether it's through films, whether it's through books, whether it's through music. Maybe it's the things that actually people consume and experience rather than our top-down leaders.
Do you think... we don't leave it to the...
No, but do you think, as the British Council here, that actually what we could do is we could make much more of our relationships in the Commonwealth? And actually that perhaps some of the other... Canada perhaps doing better than us?
Well, I think the Commonwealth is there, Kirsty, but do we go... I mean, we have not been paying enough attention to it to look like a member that is absolutely part of the family. I mean, there's a conundrum in that. I mean, the Australians, Canadians, New Zealand have taken leadership of the Commonwealth, and we would need to ask very nicely if we can come back in a way, despite the leadership with the Queen.
What's our best chance then, Neil Ferguson, in the next decade? What's our best chance for greatness, to put the great back in Britain?
Well, I don't think the rest of the world expects greatness from post-Brexit Britain. I think light relief, a comedy. That's the things that we've excelled at, rather like popular music. You see, the paradox of Britain is that we've got steadily worse at doing things like trade agreements, complex negotiations. Ultimately, Brexit happened because a complex negotiation with the European Union about Britain's special status went horribly wrong for David Cameron. And I think the negotiations of the divorce are also going pretty wrong because David Davis just isn't a match for Michel Barnier. But luckily, we are still very good at entertainment and pretty good at most forms of culture. And that is why people will continue to come to London expecting to be entertained and also amused by our politicians.
Thank you all very much indeed. And it won't just be coming to London, it'll be coming to lots of other cities throughout the United Kingdom. That's all for this evening.